Sheriff Kalen Thorne had always prided himself on knowing every soul in Millhaven, population 847. 23 years of keeping the peace in this sleepy Montana town had taught him to read the subtle rhythms of rural life like a favorite song. So when Ezra Morrison stumbled out of the Whispering Pines forest at dawn on September 15, covered in blood and speaking in broken sentences about the hungry ones, Kalen knew something fundamental had shifted in their quiet world. The call had come in at 5:47 a.m. from Delilah Chen at the gas station. Her voice trembled as she described Ezra's condition, the way his eyes rolled back showing only whites, the inhuman sounds escaping his throat. Kalen arrived to find a 60-year-old rancher collapsed against the fuel pumps, his clothes shredded, deep gashes across his arms and chest still seeping crimson. But it wasn't the wounds that made Kalen's blood run cold, it was the way Ezra's head snapped toward him with predatory focus, and the low, guttural growl that emerged from what should have been a familiar voice. Dr. Serafina Blackwood arrived within minutes, her medical bag clutched tight against her chest as she surveyed the scene. Sarah had moved to Millhaven 3 years ago, seeking refuge from the chaos of city emergency rooms, but nothing in her 15 years of medical practice had prepared her for what she witnessed that morning. Ezra's vital signs defied explanation. His body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees, his pulse was barely detectable, yet he possessed a strength that required 4 grown men to restrain him for transport to the small clinic. As word spread through Millhaven like wildfire, other disturbing reports began filtering in. Zephyr Caldwell, the town's 24-year-old IT specialist and amateur radio enthusiast, intercepted fragmented emergency broadcasts from surrounding counties. Static-filled voices spoke of similar incidents, people attacking their neighbors, overwhelming violence, and something about a rapidly spreading pathogen. The Internet, usually Zephyr's reliable source of information, offered only conflicting reports and government denials that grew less convincing by the hour. Indira Voss, the 82-year-old librarian who had survived both the blizzard of '78 and the economic collapse that nearly killed Millhaven in the '90s, recognized the signs that others missed. She had lived through enough crises to understand when the familiar world was crumbling beneath their feet. From her apartment above the library, she watched neighbors hurrying past with unusual urgency, saw the way people clustered in doorways speaking in hushed, worried tones. Change was coming whether they were ready or not. The morning took a darker turn when Thaddeus Grimm, the former Army medic who ran the town's hardware store, received a call from his old unit stationed at Fort Harrison. The conversation was brief and coded, but Thad understood the implications. His commanding officer's final words before the line went dead were simple: secure your position and trust no one showing symptoms. By noon, the situation had escalated beyond anything Millhaven's emergency protocols could handle. Ezra Morrison's condition had deteriorated rapidly despite Sarah's best efforts. His body showed signs of severe tissue necrosis, yet he remained frighteningly animated, requiring constant sedation to prevent him from attacking the medical staff. When the sedatives began losing effectiveness, Sarah made the difficult decision to restrain him completely, turning the clinic's storage room into a makeshift isolation ward. Lyra Nightingale, the 36-year-old elementary school teacher, had spent the morning trying to maintain normalcy for her students, but the children sensed the adult anxiety permeating the air. When parents began arriving early for pickup, offering no explanations beyond urgent family emergencies, Lyra dismissed classes and activated the school's crisis communication system. Her own 7-year-old daughter, Ember, clung to her side as they watched the last student disappear into a parent's worried embrace. The defining moment came at 3:17 p.m. when 17-year-old Orion Cross burst into the sheriff's office, his face pale with terror. He had been hiking near Bear Creek when he encountered what he initially thought was Mrs. Pemberton from Maple Street. But something was horribly wrong with the elderly woman. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, her mouth hung open in a permanent grimace, and when she saw Orion, she pursued him with relentless determination, making sounds no human throat should produce. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks surrounding Millhaven, Calen Thorne stood in his office staring at a map of the county, red pins marking each reported incident. The pattern was unmistakable. Something was spreading inward from the forest, consuming everything in its path. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate calls for assistance, but the responses grew fewer and more distant with each passing hour. That evening, as darkness settled over Millhaven like a burial shroud, the last television broadcasts before the signal died carried a simple message that would haunt the survivors forever: avoid all contact with infected individuals. Barricade yourselves immediately. Help is not coming. The emergency town meeting convened at sunset in the high school gymnasium, though barely half of Millhaven's residents attended. Many families had already fled, their hastily packed vehicles disappearing down Highway 89 toward what they hoped would be safety. Those who remained faced an uncomfortable truth: the outside world was crumbling faster than their isolated mountain community. Calen Thorne stood before the assembled crowd, his usually steady voice betraying the weight of impossible decisions. He had spent the afternoon coordinating with neighboring law enforcement, only to watch their communications network collapse one station at a time. The last contact had been with Deputy Martinez in Clearwater Falls, 20 miles south, whose transmission ended mid-sentence with sounds that would replay in Calen's nightmares for weeks to come. Dr. Serafina Blackwood presented her preliminary findings with clinical precision that barely masked her growing horror. Ezra Morrison's blood work revealed cellular breakdown unlike anything in medical literature, while his brain activity showed patterns consistent with severe damage to the frontal cortex, the region responsible for human reasoning and empathy. Most disturbing was the blood's apparent infectivity. Samples retained their pathogenic properties even after separation from the host, suggesting transmission through any form of contact with infected bodily fluids. Thaddeus Grimm stepped forward when Sarah finished, his military bearing commanding instant attention. He had spent the day reviewing his old emergency protocols and reaching out to former contacts across the region. The reports painted a picture of systematic infrastructure collapse, power grids failing, communication networks going dark, and military units either overwhelmed or simply vanishing from contact. Whatever was happening extended far beyond their small town's borders. Zephyr Caldwell had managed to maintain intermittent internet access using the school's satellite connection, piecing together fragments of information from social media posts, emergency broadcasts, and government websites before they went offline. The picture emerging was one of coordinated catastrophe spreading across multiple states, possibly the entire continent. Videos from major cities showed scenes of chaos that seemed impossible to believe, until similar reports began arriving from smaller communities throughout the mountain region. Indira Voss listened to the presentations with the patience of someone who had witnessed history's capacity for sudden, violent change. When the floor opened for questions, she stood slowly, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades. She reminded them of the town's isolation, 60 miles from the nearest city, surrounded by wilderness, with only 2 roads providing access to the outside world. This geographic isolation, which had always been Millhaven's limitation, might now prove to be their salvation. The debate that followed revealed the community's fractures. Some residents, led by businessman Marcus Fairweather, argued for immediate evacuation to larger cities with better resources and government protection. Others, including most of the farming families, insisted on defending their homes and livelihoods. The discussion grew heated as fear overcame neighborly politeness, voices rising in accusation and desperation. Lyra Nightingale finally called for order, her teacher's instincts taking control of the chaotic assembly. She proposed a compromise that acknowledged both the dangers of staying and the impossibility of knowing where safety might be found. Those who wished to leave should go immediately, before road conditions deteriorated further. Those who stayed would work together to create defensive positions and sustainable living arrangements for however long the crisis lasted. The vote was closer than anyone expected. 47 residents chose to remain, 31 decided to attempt evacuation the following morning. Families were torn apart by the decision, children pleading with parents, spouses unable to agree on the best path forward. The Hendricks family epitomized the heartbreak, with elderly grandmother choosing to stay while her daughter and grandchildren prepared to leave for Denver, none of them knowing if they would ever see each other again. Orion Cross surprised everyone by volunteering to help coordinate the evacuation convoy, despite being the youngest person at the meeting. His experience hiking the mountain trails made him invaluable for identifying alternate routes if the main highways proved impassable. Working with Zephyr, they mapped out 3 possible evacuation paths, each presenting unique risks and requiring different preparations. As the meeting disbanded, the remaining residents organized into work groups. Thad Grimm would oversee defensive preparations, identifying strategic locations for barricades and organizing the town's limited firearms among trained users. Sarah would establish a proper medical facility with equipment salvaged from the clinic in any homes of departing residents. Kaylin would coordinate overall security and communication efforts. The night brought little rest for anyone. Families spent precious hours dividing possessions they had accumulated over generations, trying to distinguish between necessities and treasured memories. The weight of impossible choices settled over the community like fog, obscuring the familiar landmarks of their previous lives. At 3:30 a.m., screams shattered the darkness. The sound came from the Morrison Ranch, 5 miles north of town center. When Kaylin and Thad arrived at the property, they found the house dark and silent, the front door hanging open like a wound. Inside, they discovered evidence of violence, overturned furniture, blood on the walls, and most chilling of all, no bodies. The Morrison family had simply vanished, leaving behind only signs of struggle and the lingering scent of decay. The discovery transformed the evacuation from an orderly departure into desperate flight. Dawn found 24 vehicles racing down Highway 89, their occupants clutching children and photographs, prayers, and hope their only remaining possessions. Those who stayed watched the convoy disappear around the mountain curve, wondering if they had made the right choice, knowing it was too late to change their minds. The morning after the evacuation brought an eerie silence to Millhaven that seemed to press against the survivors like a physical weight. 47 people remained, scattered across a town designed for nearly 20 times their number. The empty houses stood like monuments to departed hopes, their darkened windows reflecting the growing realization that they were truly alone. Kaylin Thorne established the high school as their primary stronghold, recognizing its strategic advantages, multiple exits, solid construction, and centralized location within the town's defensive perimeter. The building's proximity to both the hardware store and medical clinic made it ideal for coordinating their survival efforts. He appointed rotating watch shifts, pairing experienced residents with younger volunteers to ensure constant vigilance without exhausting their limited personnel. Thaddeus Grimm approached fortification with military precision, transforming Millhaven's gentle suburban landscape into a defensive network. He identified 3 concentric defensive lines, the outer perimeter following the town's natural boundaries, a middle ring incorporating strategic buildings, and an inner sanctuary centered on the high school. Working with volunteers, he reinforced key structures and established supply caches at predetermined locations throughout their territory. The hardware store became their armory and workshop, its familiar aisles now serving a grimmer purpose. Thad inventoried their weapons, hunting rifles, shotguns, and handguns owned by various residents, alongside potential improvised armaments. The selection was modest but functional, though ammunition would become a critical concern if their situation extended beyond a few weeks. More importantly, they began modifying tools for close-quarters defense, creating spears from kitchen knives and garden implements. Dr. Serafina Blackwood converted the school's nurse office into a proper medical station, supplementing its basic equipment with supplies gathered from the abandoned clinic in several residents' homes. Her biggest challenge was not the lack of equipment but the absence of pharmaceutical resources for treating potential infections. The nearest hospital pharmacy lay 60 miles away, and the roads between here and there had become increasingly treacherous. Zephyr Caldwell managed to restore partial communication capabilities using a combination of ham radio equipment and the school's satellite internet connection. The outside world painted an increasingly bleak picture. Major cities reported widespread infrastructure collapse, government emergency broadcasts had ceased entirely, and the few remaining radio signals carried desperate pleas for help rather than coordinated relief efforts. Most troubling were the reports from other mountain communities describing coordinated attacks by groups of infected individuals moving with apparent purpose. Indira Vos established the library as their information and planning center, her decades of organizational experience proving invaluable for coordinating their complex survival requirements. She created detailed schedules for guard duties, supply distribution, and maintenance tasks, ensuring that every resident understood their role in the community's survival. Her calm authority provided stability as personalities clashed under the stress of their unprecedented situation. The first test of their defenses came on the third day, when Lyra Nightingale spotted movement near the town's eastern entrance during her morning watch shift. 3 figures approached along the main road, their gait unmistakably wrong, jerky, purposeless, yet driven by some terrible compulsion. As they drew closer, the survivors recognized the horrifying truth: these had once been the Patterson family, who lived on a farm 15 miles out of town. The Pattersons' transformation was complete and terrifying. Their clothes hung in tatters, their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and their eyes held no recognition of their former selves. Most disturbing was their behavior. They moved as a coordinated unit, responding to stimuli with shared purpose that suggested some form of collective consciousness governing their actions. Kaylin made the devastating decision to engage them before they could reach the town center. Working with Thad and 2 volunteers, they established positions behind the makeshift barricades at the eastern checkpoint. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, but its psychological impact would resonate through the community for days. The infected showed no fear, no pain response, and continued attacking until physically incapacitated. Even more troubling, their wounds showed no signs of normal bleeding, suggesting that conventional medical understanding no longer applied. Sarah's examination of the remains provided crucial intelligence about their enemy. The infected displayed evidence of accelerated decomposition while maintaining motor function, brain activity concentrated in the most primitive regions, and complete absence of normal pain or self-preservation responses. Most significantly, their blood and tissue remained infectious even after death, requiring extreme caution in disposal and decontamination procedures. The aftermath of the encounter forced the survivors to confront harsh realities about their situation. They were not simply waiting out a temporary crisis but fighting for survival against an enemy that defied conventional understanding. The infected showed coordination and purpose that suggested intelligence, while their physical capabilities presented threats that traditional defensive measures might not adequately address. Orion Cross emerged as an unexpected asset during the crisis, his familiarity with the surrounding wilderness proving crucial for establishing early warning systems. Working with Zephyr, he identified elevated positions throughout the mountains where they could place observation posts and communication relays. His youth and agility made him ideal for reconnaissance missions that would be too dangerous for older residents. As evening fell on their third day, the survivors gathered in the school's cafeteria for their first communal meal since the evacuation. The simple act of sharing food and conversation provided a brief respite from the constant tension, allowing them to remember their humanity amid the growing horror. Children played quietly while adults spoke in hushed tones about rationing, security, and the increasingly likely possibility that rescue was not coming. The night brought new challenges as strange sounds echoed from the forest surrounding Millhaven. Not the familiar calls of wildlife they had known all their lives, but something else: organized movement, distant communication between unseen entities, and the growing certainty that they were being watched, studied, and perhaps surrounded by forces they could not yet comprehend. Week 2 began with a discovery that shattered any remaining illusions about their predicament. Young Orion Cross, returning from his morning perimeter check, reported fresh tracks circling their defensive positions, dozens of footprints that appeared human but showed none of the random wandering patterns they had observed before. The infected were no longer stumbling blindly through their territory, they were conducting organized reconnaissance. Dr. Serafina Blackwood confirmed their worst fears when she completed her analysis of tissue samples from the Patterson family encounter. The pathogen responsible for the transformation was unlike anything in medical literature, a rapidly spreading agent that seemed to rewrite fundamental biological processes while leaving certain brain functions intact. Most disturbing was her discovery that the infected retained enough cognitive ability to learn, adapt, and potentially coordinate complex behaviors. The implications hit Thaddeus Grimm like a physical blow. His military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not an enemy that combined zombie-like resilience with tactical intelligence. He immediately began revising their defensive strategies, recognizing that static fortifications would prove inadequate against adversaries capable of strategic thinking. They needed mobility, multiple fallback positions, and contingency plans for scenarios he had hoped never to consider. Zephyr Caldwell's radio monitoring sessions painted an increasingly grim picture of the outside world. The few remaining emergency broadcasts spoke of coordinated attacks on military installations, evacuation centers overwhelmed by infected individuals who seemed to target large gatherings specifically, and disturbing reports of infected groups working together to breach supposedly secure facilities. The pattern suggested something far more threatening than random outbreak. This appeared to be warfare conducted by an enemy that understood human weaknesses. The community's first major loss came during what should have been a routine supply run. Marcus Steinberg and Elena Rodriguez had volunteered to gather medical supplies from the abandoned clinic, a mission that had been completed safely multiple times. They never returned. When Kaylin Thorne and 2 volunteers went searching, they found the clinic ransacked and signs of struggle, but no bodies. More troubling were the methodical nature of the destruction and evidence that someone, or something, had been searching for specific items. Lyra Nightingale struggled to maintain morale as the children in their group began showing signs of severe stress. 7-year-old Ember had stopped speaking entirely, while 12-year-old Jamie Voss, Indira's great-nephew, suffered nightmares that left him screaming about the hungry eyes watching from the forest. The psychological toll of their situation was becoming as dangerous as the physical threats they faced. The breaking point came on day 10 when their perimeter alarms triggered simultaneously from 3 different directions. This was not the random approach they had learned to expect from individual infected, it was a coordinated assault. Kaylin's team rushed to their defensive positions as dozens of infected emerged from the tree line, moving with tactical precision that defied everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The battle for Millhaven's eastern checkpoint lasted 3 hours and cost them dearly. The infected showed sophisticated understanding of their defensive layout, probing for weaknesses and adapting their approach when initial attacks failed. Most terrifying was their apparent ability to communicate, using a series of clicks and growls that suggested complex information exchange between individual units. Thad Grimm fell during the second wave of attacks, overwhelmed while protecting the ammunition cache near the hardware store. His final act was detonating an improvised explosive that eliminated 6 infected but left the survivors without their most experienced tactical leader. The loss devastated group morale and eliminated their most valuable military asset when they could least afford such casualties. Sarah worked frantically to treat the wounded, including Orion Cross, who had suffered severe lacerations while helping evacuate civilians from the compromised eastern sector. Her medical supplies dwindled rapidly, and the constant stress of treating trauma under combat conditions pushed her to the edge of exhaustion. Worse, she began noticing symptoms in some residents that might indicate exposure to the pathogen through contact with infected blood. The infected's tactical withdrawal was almost as disturbing as their coordinated assault. Rather than pressing their advantage or scattering randomly, they pulled back in organized fashion, taking their fallen with them and leaving no useful intelligence about their capabilities or intentions. The survivors found themselves victorious in a battle that felt more like a reconnaissance probe than a serious attempt at conquest. Indira Voss called for an emergency meeting that evening, her usual composure cracking under the weight of their deteriorating situation. The community had lost nearly 20% of their fighting capacity in a single engagement, their defenses had been thoroughly tested and found wanting, and most troubling of all, they now faced an enemy that demonstrated learning abilities and tactical sophistication. The debate that followed exposed deep fractures within their group. Some residents, led by Sarah Kim, argued for immediate evacuation to deeper wilderness areas where they might avoid detection. Others, including Kaylin, insisted that abandoning their fortified position would leave them completely vulnerable to mobile assault forces. The discussion grew heated as exhaustion and grief overcame their usual civility. Zephyr Caldwell's evening radio session brought news that silenced the argument entirely. A faint transmission from survivors in Helena described similar coordinated attacks occurring simultaneously across multiple communities, suggesting that the infected were operating according to some form of regional strategy. The implications were staggering. They were not facing random outbreak but organized conquest by an enemy that retained enough intelligence to conduct military operations. As night fell over their battered community, the survivors faced a terrible realization. They were not simply trying to outlast a crisis, they were fighting a war against an enemy that was learning, adapting, and potentially winning. The comfortable illusion that help would eventually arrive had been replaced by the stark understanding that they were truly alone in a world that no longer belonged to humanity. The children's dreams that night were filled with the clicking sounds that had echoed across the battlefield, a noise that seemed to speak of hunger, intelligence, and patient planning by minds that had once been human but were now something else entirely. The discovery came at dawn on day 15, delivered by Orion Cross in a voice barely above a whisper. During his nighttime reconnaissance, he had found the missing evacuation convoy, or what remained of it. 23 vehicles sat abandoned along Highway 89, doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered across the asphalt like the remnants of shattered dreams. But there were no bodies. No signs of the 31 people who had fled Millhaven 2 weeks earlier seeking safety in the outside world. Dr. Serafina Blackwood accompanied the recovery team to examine the scene, her medical training the only thing keeping her functional as she processed the implications. The vehicle showed signs of coordinated attack, windows shattered from multiple directions, evidence of occupants being dragged from their cars, and most chilling of all, bloodstains that formed patterns suggesting the victims had been systematically sorted rather than randomly attacked. Kalen Thorne found himself questioning every decision that had brought them to this moment. The convoy had included families with young children, elderly residents, and people who had trusted his judgment about evacuation timing and route selection. Among the abandoned vehicles was the Henderson family car, still containing the teddy bear that 5-year-old Amy had clutched during the town meeting. The sight of that small, innocent toy covered in dried blood nearly broke his resolve entirely. The psychological impact rippled through their community like a shock wave. Lyra Nightingale watched her daughter Ember retreat further into silence, the child's eyes holding a hollow understanding that no 7-year-old should possess. Other children began exhibiting signs of severe trauma, night terrors, regression to earlier developmental stages, and a haunting acceptance of violence that spoke to their forced acceleration into an adult world of horror. Zephyr Caldwell's radio monitoring revealed the collapse of the last major communications networks in their region. The emergency frequencies that had provided their only connection to the outside world now carried nothing but static, interrupted occasionally by desperate individual transmissions that cut off mid-sentence. They were truly isolated now, with no way to call for help and no knowledge of whether organized resistance existed anywhere else. Indira Voss recognized the signs of community breakdown that she had witnessed during previous crises, but this situation exceeded anything in her experience. People were beginning to hoard supplies despite their agreed-upon rationing system, relationships were fracturing under stress, and some residents spoke openly about abandoning the group to strike out on their own. The social bonds that held their survival effort together were unraveling at precisely the moment when unity was most crucial. The second coordinated attack came on day 17, but this time the infected demonstrated tactical evolution that surpassed their worst fears. Rather than the direct assault they had expected, the enemy launched a psychological warfare campaign designed to shatter their morale and force critical mistakes. Throughout the night, the infected surrounded their perimeter and began making sounds. Not the random growls they had grown accustomed to, but deliberate mimicry of human voices. The voices belonged to people they had known and lost. Marcus Steinberg's voice called out from the darkness, pleading for help and claiming to be trapped but uninfected. Elena Rodriguez's voice promised crucial information about the enemy's weaknesses if they would just open the barricades. Most devastating of all were the voices of children from the evacuation convoy, crying for their parents and begging to be allowed back home to safety. Sarah struggled to treat residents suffering complete psychological breakdown from the auditory assault. Several people attempted to leave their defensive positions to investigate the familiar voices, requiring physical restraint to prevent them from walking into obvious traps. The infected's ability to perfectly replicate not just voices but speech patterns and emotional inflections suggested cognitive abilities that remained largely intact despite their physical transformation. The truth about the infected's intelligence became undeniably clear when they began describing details about the survivors' daily routines, personal relationships, and defensive preparations that could only have been obtained through systematic observation. The enemy had been studying them for weeks, learning their habits, identifying their weaknesses, and preparing for this moment of maximum psychological impact. Orion Cross volunteered for the most dangerous mission of their survival, infiltrating the infected perimeter to gather intelligence about their enemy's true capabilities. His youth and familiarity with the mountain terrain made him their best chance of approaching undetected, but the psychological cost of what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The infected had established a sophisticated camp in the forest, complete with organized patrols, designated roles for different individuals, and most terrifying of all, crude but effective tools fashioned for specific purposes. The night assault that followed tested every aspect of their survival preparations. The infected approached with military-style coordination, using distraction techniques to divide the defenders' attention while infiltration teams attempted to breach their perimeter at multiple points. The battle revealed the enemy's most horrifying adaptation. They had learned to use weapons, wielding captured firearms with deadly accuracy that eliminated any advantage the survivors had hoped to maintain through superior equipment. Dr. Serafina Blackwood made a discovery during the battle that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. While treating a wounded defender, she noticed that one of the attacking infected bore surgical scars identical to those she had observed on Ezra Morrison during his initial examination. The infected were not random victims of an outbreak, they were the returned dead, people who had died and somehow been restored to a mockery of life that retained memory, intelligence, and an insatiable hunger for the living. The revelation that they were fighting their own returned dead rather than simply infected neighbors shattered the last vestiges of hope that some form of cure or treatment might be possible. These were not sick people who might recover with proper medical care, they were something entirely new, neither truly alive nor completely dead, existing in a state that challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and human consciousness. As dawn broke over Millhaven after the longest night of their lives, the survivors counted their losses and faced a terrible truth. They had successfully defended their position, but at a cost that left them with barely enough people to maintain basic security. More importantly, they now understood that they were fighting an enemy that possessed human intelligence, military organization, and supernatural resilience, an adversary that was patient, adaptive, and ultimately unstoppable. The sound of Ember's voice, speaking for the first time in days, cut through the morning air like a blade. "Mama, they're never going to leave us alone, are they?" Lyra Nightingale had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. Day 25 dawned with an unnatural stillness that set every survivor's nerves on edge. The infected had withdrawn from their immediate perimeter 3 days earlier, leaving behind an ominous quiet that felt more threatening than their constant presence had been. Kaelin Thorne understood the tactical implications. Their enemy was preparing for a final, decisive assault that would end the siege of Millhaven once and for all. Dr. Serafina Blackwood worked frantically to prepare for mass casualties, knowing that their medical supplies were nearly exhausted and that any serious wounds sustained during the coming battle would likely prove fatal. She had converted the school's library into a makeshift trauma center, but with only basic equipment and no possibility of evacuation to proper medical facilities, her ability to save lives would be severely limited. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical burden. Zephyr Caldwell's final radio transmission to the outside world carried little hope of response, but he felt compelled to document their situation for anyone who might eventually discover their remains. He broadcast their coordinates, described the tactical evolution of the infected, and provided detailed information about their enemy's capabilities that might prove useful to other survivors. The message concluded with coordinates to supply caches they had hidden throughout the mountains, a final gift to anyone who might follow in their footsteps. Indira Voss spent her time creating a written record of their survival efforts, documenting the names of the fallen and the lessons they had learned through bitter experience. Her chronicle would serve as both memorial and tactical manual, preserving the knowledge they had gained at such terrible cost. She worked with methodical determination, knowing that this might be humanity's only lasting testimony about the true nature of their enemy. Orion Cross had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment of all, infiltrating the infected staging area to gather intelligence about their final assault plans. His reconnaissance revealed a force of nearly 200 infected individuals organized into distinct tactical units, each equipped with weapons and displaying coordination that suggested central command structure. Most terrifying was the discovery that the infected had been gathering reinforcements from across the entire mountain region, assembling a force specifically designed to overwhelm Millhaven's remaining defenses. The young man's report confirmed what they had all suspected. This was not a random attack but a carefully planned military operation designed to eliminate the last pocket of human resistance in their territory. The infected understood that Millhaven represented more than just a group of survivors. They were living proof that humans could organize effective resistance against the new order that was spreading across the continent. Lyra Nightingale made the most difficult decision of her life, agreeing to evacuate the children and elderly residents to a hidden cave system that Orion had discovered in the high mountains. The shelter could support a small group for several weeks, long enough for the battle's outcome to be decided. Her daughter Ember would be among those evacuated, a choice that felt like tearing out her own heart but offered the only chance of preserving innocent lives. The evacuation party consisted of 8 individuals, 5 children including Ember, 2 elderly residents, and Indira Voss who would serve as their guardian and group leader. They carried minimal supplies but maximum hope, representing the possibility that some trace of Millhaven's community might survive regardless of the battle's outcome. Their departure at sunset felt like a funeral for the living, an acknowledgement that families were being separated with little chance of reunion. Sarah remained behind despite having the opportunity to leave with the evacuation group, her medical oath compelling her to stay with the defenders who would need her skills during the coming battle. She understood that her chances of survival were minimal, but she could not abandon the wounded and dying when they would need her most. Her decision inspired others to stay and fight, demonstrating that courage could emerge from the most desperate circumstances. The infected's final psychological assault began at midnight, as hundreds of voices called out from the darkness surrounding Millhaven. But these were not the familiar voices of lost friends and family, they were new voices, strangers whose identities suggested that the infected force included individuals from across the entire region. The enemy was announcing that Millhaven's fall would complete their conquest of the mountain territories, eliminating the last organized human presence in hundreds of square miles. Kalen Thorne addressed his remaining defenders, 19 individuals who had chosen to make their final stand in defense of their home. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the hope that their resistance might buy time for other survivors elsewhere. But privately, he understood that they were fighting not for victory but for the right to die as human beings rather than submit to transformation into something else entirely. The assault began at dawn with coordinated attacks from all directions simultaneously, overwhelming the survivors' ability to maintain defensive coverage across their entire perimeter. The infected demonstrated tactical sophistication that equaled professional military forces, using covering fire, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated timing that suggested extensive planning and rehearsal. The battle for Millhaven had become a textbook military engagement fought between human defenders and an enemy that had once been human but was now something else entirely. Zephyr Caldwell's final transmission cut off mid-sentence as the communication center was overrun, but not before he managed to activate the emergency beacon that would mark their location for any rescue forces that might eventually arrive. The beacon would broadcast for 30 days before its battery died, providing one last hope that their sacrifice might serve some greater purpose in humanity's struggle for survival. As the defensive perimeter collapsed and the infected swarmed through Millhaven streets, the survivors fought with desperate courage, selling their lives dearly in battles that raged from house to house. Each defender understood that they were fighting not just for their own survival but for the principle that humanity would not surrender without resistance, regardless of how hopeless their situation had become. The last transmission from Millhaven came from Dr. Serafina Blackwood, speaking into a handheld radio as infected forces closed in on the school's medical center. "This is Dr. Blackwood, Millhaven Survivor Group. We are overrun but not defeated. The infected retain human intelligence and military organization. They are not random victims but organized enemy forces. Tell others. Warn them. Remember us. 30 days after the fall of Millhaven, the emergency beacon's final transmission cut through the static-filled airwaves, reaching ears that still remembered how to hope. A search and rescue team from the Montana National Guard, operating out of a secure facility in Glacier National Park, received the coordinates and prepared for what they expected to be another recovery mission in a landscape littered with the remains of failed communities. Captain Rebecca Martinez led the 12-person team through the mountain passes toward Millhaven, her soldiers equipped with the latest intelligence about infected behavior patterns and tactical capabilities. The briefings had described coordinated enemy forces with human-level intelligence, but nothing had prepared them for what they discovered in the aftermath of the mountain community's final battle. Millhaven stood as a monument to human resistance, its empty streets telling the story of a community that had fought with everything they possessed against an enemy that defied conventional understanding. The defensive positions showed evidence of sophisticated military engineering, improvised weapons that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, and tactical modifications that suggested the defenders had learned and adapted throughout their siege. The high school bore the heaviest scars of battle, its halls and classrooms transformed into defensive positions where the final stands had taken place. In the library-turned-medical center, Captain Martinez's team found Dr. Serafina Blackwood's medical records, documenting the infected's physiological characteristics with scientific precision that would prove invaluable to researchers attempting to understand their enemy. Her notes revealed patterns of infection, behavioral observations, and tactical intelligence that had cost human lives to obtain. Zephyr Caldwell's communication center yielded perhaps the most valuable intelligence, detailed logs of radio transmissions that mapped the infections spread across the entire mountain region, tactical reports about infected behavior patterns, and most importantly, coordinates for supply caches hidden throughout the wilderness. His final entries described infected forces numbering in the thousands, organized into regional commands that suggested a level of strategic planning that elevated them from outbreak to occupying army. The discovery of Indira Vasa's chronicle in the library's basement provided the search team with a complete record of Millhaven's 30-day survival struggle. Her detailed documentation of each day's events, tactical lessons learned, and psychological observations about community survival under extreme stress became required reading for all military units operating in infected territories. Her final entry, dated the morning of the last battle, concluded with simple words that would inspire resistance fighters for years to come: "We chose to remain human." But the most remarkable discovery came from the hidden cave system in the high mountains, where 8 survivors had endured 15 days of isolation following Millhaven's fall. Indira Vasa had died of natural causes 3 days after the evacuation, but not before ensuring that the children understood their responsibility to preserve the memory of their community's sacrifice. 7-year-old Ember Nightingale, who had witnessed horrors that no child should survive, became the primary witness to Millhaven's final days. The children's testimony revealed details about the infected's organization that military intelligence had not previously understood. They described seeing infected forces conducting training exercises in the forest, establishing permanent camps with designated roles for different individuals, and most significantly, engaging in what appeared to be strategic planning sessions where complex information was exchanged through sophisticated communication methods. Orion Cross, now 18 years old and bearing scars both physical and psychological from his reconnaissance missions, provided the most detailed intelligence about infected capabilities. His descriptions of their weapons usage, tactical coordination, and apparent command structure fundamentally changed military understanding of the threat they faced. The infected were not merely aggressive victims of a disease, they were an organized enemy force conducting territorial conquest with military precision. The evacuation of the surviving children and their integration into the secure facility sparked debates about humanity's future that echoed throughout the remaining government installations. These young witnesses carried knowledge about living under siege, organizing community defense, and maintaining human values in the face of overwhelming horror. Their experiences became foundational material for training programs designed to prepare other communities for similar attacks. Captain Martinez's team established a permanent observation post in Millhaven, using the town as a base for monitoring infected activity throughout the mountain region. The defensive positions created by the original survivors proved remarkably effective when properly manned and supplied, validating the tactical innovations that had emerged from desperate necessity. Millhaven became a symbol of effective resistance that inspired similar defensive preparations throughout the remaining human territories. The infected forces that had conquered Millhaven eventually moved on to other targets, but they left behind clear evidence of their organizational capabilities. The town's buildings showed signs of systematic searching rather than random destruction, suggesting that the infected had been looking for specific materials or information. Most disturbing was evidence that they had established a temporary administration center in the town hall, complete with organized record-keeping systems that implied long-term strategic planning. 6 months after the fall of Millhaven, Ember Nightingale stood before a gathering of military commanders and civilian leaders at the Glacier National Park facility, her young voice carrying the weight of impossible experience as she described her community's final days. Her testimony concluded with words that her mother Lyra had spoken during their last conversation: "We fought not because we believed we could win, but because being human means fighting for what matters, even when hope is gone." The mountain winds that swept through Millhaven's empty streets carried stories of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible price of resistance against an enemy that had once been human but was now something else entirely. The town stood as both memorial and warning, a reminder that humanity's survival would require more than military might or defensive technology. It would demand the preservation of those values that made resistance meaningful, even in the face of certain defeat. In the hidden places where survivors gathered to plan their next moves against the infected occupation, Millhaven's name became synonymous with honorable resistance. The community had fallen, but their legacy lived on in the knowledge they had preserved, the tactics they had developed, and the proof they had provided that human beings could choose dignity and courage even when facing impossible odds. Their final transmission continued to echo across the airwaves of a changed world: "Remember us."